and TV Plus boxes. Simulcast on DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Informing, advising, and entertaining the Filipinos and OFWs around the world. Streaming live on www.facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 a.m. or on YouTube, channel DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Radio Bandido.
Hello, Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam here on DZRJ and RJTV. My name is Eric Lecain. Thank you so much for tuning in to us here on Channel 224 on Sky Cable and on the radio and on YouTube and on Facebook. We bring you the most interesting stories from around the world, keeping you updated as to what's going on outside the borders of the Philippines. This week, we'll be talking about the January 6 hearings in the U.S., the harsh reality of what's going on in Sri Lanka, Biden's tightrope walk to his visit of the Middle East, that maddening video of the Texas school shooting, which is unbelievable, and lots more. All the biggest news of the week around the world. But first, remember when we were talking about monkeypox? I was saying, don't worry about it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't go out and hang out with a barrel of monkeys. Scientists were telling us there's so few cases, it's really not that contagious, at least not like the coronavirus. But now here we are. Just like in the corona times, it's New York. It's getting things rolling here. Over the past month, the cases of monkeypox in the New York area have gone from 10 to 336. That means the infection rate is up 30 times what it was just a month ago. Can you imagine if that jumped up another 30 times by next month? Now, just to be clear, no one has died in New York from the virus yet. There's multiple treatment methods, but it's still not that far from getting smallpox. In other words, monkeypox is not a pleasant experience. It's fevers, chills, muscle aches, that weird rash that you get that has the appearance of boils all over the body. One man in New York described it as extremely painful. He said every time you go to the bathroom, it's like being stabbed with knives. He was complaining to his doctors how they just don't seem to understand how bad it is, and that sending people home with Tylenol for the pain is not a solution. But the biggest complaint in New York, anyway, is the vaccine rollout has been less than stellar. The site for registration for the vaccine has gone down for the third time. And there has been huge supply issues. Why are there supply issues? Well, the vaccines are stuck in Denmark. Yes, in Denmark, because that's where they are manufactured. And the FDA wants to check the factory first to make sure it's up to the standards of monkeypox vaccines. The issue many are having is, why is the FDA so worried when the EU's inspection agency already said the place was good to go? So in New York, they have asked for another 14,500 shots, but this is still nowhere near the demand for the vaccine. And here's something interesting to add to this story. In New York, it's mostly the gay community that's getting hit with the virus. Turns out that the easy way of contracting the virus is males having sex with other males. Right now in San Diego, they are prioritizing the vaccines for men in the gay community. There, the monkeypox virus has been spread primarily through rave parties. That's where you dance in huge crowds and everyone's bumping into you. Monkeypox is mainly spread through body-to-body contact. That's mostly through fluids, like sweat being passed. It can also be passed through wearing clothes by someone who has it, or sleeping in the bed where an infected person has been. And of course, respiratory secretions, but not like COVID was. Monkeypox must be prolonged contact, such as kissing or cuddling or sex. It can also be passed from a mother to her unborn baby. While not as contagious as COVID, it's still pretty bad. Right now, Spain, Germany, the UK, and the US are all leading the spread of the monkeypox virus. And here again, the primary people getting the virus are men who are gay or bisexual. Now, monkeypox has been around for decades, but what's so interesting or scary is that the outbreaks are not in African countries where you would normally see this kind of thing. They're in places like the US. Now, so far in the Philippines, there have been suspected cases. However, as far as I can find, no confirmed cases of monkeypox. But the country is pretending as if it's coming here and are preparing just in case it does. Now, I know that monkeypox is giving us a big deja vu because we just had COVID. But these are two very different viruses. Monkeypox is not anywhere near as deadly as the COVID virus, but still it sounds pretty bad. Let's just hope that it does not mutate into some other kind of animal disease, because monkeypox already sounds pretty bad. All right, in a related story, a Filipino nurse named May Parsons received the prestigious George Cross Award on behalf of the National Health Service of England. What did she do to get this award? Well, she gave the very first COVID vaccine. It was a Pfizer vaccine given to a 90-year-old woman. The award was given out by none other than Elizabeth, the Queen of England, and her son, Prince Charles. The George Cross Award recognizes the courage, compassion, and dedication of medical people. It was first introduced in 1940 by King George VI and is the highest award given by the British government to a non-military citizen for their acts of the greatest heroism or of the most courage in circumstances of extreme danger. This Filipino nurse wrote on her Facebook page that she is deeply honored and said that we remember all our fallen colleagues who have given the ultimate sacrifice, and I cannot be more proud of our achievements as a whole. She obtained her nursing degree from UST, the University of St. Thomas here in Manila. She was featured on Good Morning Britain, where she said, "I think it is a historical event for Filipinos across the entire world, that we are proud of what we have achieved and what we contribute to everyone and the care that we give." You know, it's nice to hear stories like this about Filipinos in the midst of all that's going on in the world. Just to recap, currently the Philippines is sitting on 3,725,382 confirmed cases of COVID and 60,641 deaths. I guess we can think about how high that number might be without the trained nurses here in the Philippines, which honestly have put themselves in danger multiple times during the last few years of this pandemic. One more story, which is actually happening in my home state of North Carolina. Cases are trending upwards in North Carolina due to something called the Ninja variant. Its real name is BA.5 Omicron subvariant. The problem with this one is that if you are fully vaccinated and you have had COVID before, you can still get it very easily. There's one silver lining, and that is that there have not been so many hospitalizations because most people have been vaccinated. And that's having a big effect on the lower number of people going to the hospital. So that's where we are with the Ninja variant. Currently, it accounts for 65% of all the cases in the southern region of the U.S. So, if you are near a subvariant of the COVID that carries a sword and wears a black suit, knows kung fu, stay away. This is Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Remember a few months ago, we were talking about the craziness going on in Sri Lanka? That the country had been horribly mismanaged during the COVID crisis. And everything the president did, every decision he made seemed to just make it worse. People were protesting about everything in the country. The inflation was off the scale. They could not make their debt payments. The president cut taxes, but then they had to print more money. Moves like this usually end up in disaster, and that's what happened in Sri Lanka. When the dust began to settle, the president sent out an email announcing he would resign. However, he did it from Singapore, where he had escaped to. The most beautiful, most grandest building Sri Lanka had, where the president lived, well, that's been taken over by the protesters, who had enough of the president and his family, and they stormed the Capitol. They basically turned the exquisite palace into a tourist attraction. So over the past week, people have been lining up for hours to walk into the palace to get a good look at where all their money has been going. To the luxurious lifestyle of how the presidents live while the country continued to get poorer and poorer. The locals were now using the perfectly cured lawns to have picnics, and protesters were swimming in the palace pool. Sri Lanka's parliamentary speaker accepted the resignation of the president and said that this was really the only option he had. The people of Sri Lanka are tired and hungry and very angry. They are demanding change and accountability because they are sick of seeing the same faces year after year in charge. Anyway, the president may be gone, but where does that leave Sri Lanka now? As it struggles in the middle of a ruinous financial crisis, experts are saying that it's going to get worse before it gets better. Since the current president tried to stay in power there have been 3 cabinets in 2 months, and now there will be a 4th. But someone's going to have to restore the country and do it soon. Right now, it's not so much how the cabinet's back and how to get the government settled, but they need to feed the people. There's no medicine. There's no fuel. Someone needs to get the lights back on there. Many have spoken out about Sri Lanka as a ticking time bomb, even before COVID, when the major problems there seem to be becoming more and more apparent. It's the same old story that we hear over and over. One family continues to get reelected over and over, and they gave huge tax cuts to their rich friends, money that should be going into investment for the millions of the non-rich people living in the country and pay down the country's debt. One of the issues that keeps coming up, that keeps getting talked about, is the debt owed to China by Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka hired China's firm for a $381 million project to build a port, a seaport, which the government couldn't pay off the debt. So another Chinese company leased the port to help out with the payments. But what worried many was that China could easily foreclose on the project because it's China. And there was all these Chinese companies that were now in control of the ports of Sri Lanka. They might want to at one point use the ports for a naval military place or close it down altogether. I have to say the Sri Lanka military was using it, and the deal was that the port could not be traded off as it was only guaranteed for the money. So, in other words, Sri Lanka must pay its debt on the port. This has been a problem sometimes for other countries who have borrowed from China, if you know what I mean. Other issues have been remittance fees. This is what happened when your currency loses too much value. People don't want to use banks anymore for remittance because you can get a much better conversion rate outside the country or on the internet. This ended up having the banks run out of foreign currency. Any of that sound familiar? Now they are starting to dip into the reserves, and when you do that, now you start to put your debts in jeopardy. What about tourism? Since the bombing in 2019 and the COVID and the war, tourism has dropped to nothing in Sri Lanka. Most tourism comes from Ukrainians and the Russians. And not to mention the fact that Sri Lanka exports tea, nearly all of it, to Russia. Currently, with all these sanctions going on, it's very hard to sell or do any kind of trading with Russia, which is a big problem in Sri Lanka. But the real problems start when the power keeps going out. The government had to make power cuts, sometimes 12 hours a day, and that's just too much. People really just started saying, hey, we can't sit by and watch these politicians ruin our country. So what does a country do when the president is just ruining it? Well, they protest. Protests were peaceful for a while until the police started shooting water cannons and tear gas at the people. Then the whole place just went berserk. People started getting arrested. The prime minister resigned. Then they set the family house on fire of the family of the president. But his brother, the brother to the president, the president refused to quit. He refused to resign. But as of now, the brother and the brother who was the president, the brother is the prime minister, the brother is the president, they are out. But the problems are just beginning for the family of the ex-prime minister and the ex-finance minister and the ex-president. Two of those guys have been blocked from leaving the country. The president got out, but he left all his brothers there. And now, guess who's taking the fall for all these problems in Sri Lanka? The new current prime minister is now the president, as protesters have now given control of the presidential palace back to the government, which they took control of last Saturday. But the guy who took over the prime minister who's now taking over the presidency, and as you might have guessed, he's not very popular. Many people are plotting on how to absorb the power that seems to be currently going on now in the weakest possible state that Sri Lanka is in. The problem is, whoever eventually will take power in Sri Lanka, there's no food, there's no fuel, there's no medicine, all basic supplies, everything the public needs, they just don't have. What does a president do when a family of politicians has burned their country to the ground and they have fled, or they are currently trying to flee? While the money is gone and China are sitting on mountains of debt waiting to gobble up whatever it can, no one wants to visit you because your country is in horrible shape. So there goes your tourism. This is the same story of several countries throughout the last few decades. They all seem to be having the same problem. So let's see if this one can pull itself out of the pool before it completely drowns. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Speaking of countries split up, let's move over to Israel. This past week, the U.S. President Joe Biden made his first trip to Israel to talk to the current prime minister there. Of course, we talk about Israel from time to time here on the show and the unending conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This land is my land, this land is your land, and if you step over the line, my military jet will bomb your homes. So, in any case, before Biden came, his Secretary of State asked the Israeli government, could you please lay off the assault on the Palestinians while Biden is in town? The Secretary asked if they could not do things like home demolition, evictions of Palestinians, decisions on settlement buildings, and please decrease the Israeli military operations in the West Bank, at least until after Biden leaves. Well, the Israelis said they will do their best, but explain the domestic political complexities of halting such actions, in addition to what they call the operational needs of the Israeli army in order to stop attacks from the Palestinians. In other words, they need to continue attacks on the Palestinians. That, I believe, means it does not matter if the U.S. continually says, can you please, pretty please, stop killing these people and illegally evicting them from their homes, which much of the world believes they are doing. But even if the president of the U.S. is there, they can only say, well, we'll try, but, probably not, because we have already set it up for this week. And, that's what we do. We kill Palestinians. I mean, all the Biden administration asked for was for them to stop killing the Palestinians for just a few days. But then after we're gone, well, you can go back to what you were doing. But the Israelis can't even promise to stop even for a few days. This is kind of where we are with this situation. For decades and decades, American presidents have tried to stop the unending conflict in Israel, and for decades and decades, they have failed. Everyone wants this small country, and nothing's there but desert and sand. Oh, the sand is so sacred. There are two ethnic groups that will never, ever get along. The Palestinians, who were kind of there first, but are living in absolute poverty and can be thrown out of their homes at any time. Literally, this is not far from the way the blacks were in South Africa during apartheid. I mean, just recently on the show, we were talking about the Israeli Defense Force shooting an American Palestinian journalist in the head. She was that woman from the Al Jazeera News Network. Many still say that she was the target for things that she had written about, including the many atrocities of the Israeli government. So Biden's visit there is very fragile. And he has to be careful about what he says, which is why many, including me, were very surprised with what Biden finally did say. He said, let's go with the two-state solution. Israelis on this side, Palestinians on this side, and done. Easy peasy. Peace in the Middle East. Palestinians are like, yeah, that sounds good. And the Israelis are like, I don't think so. I mean, Biden said that the Palestinians need to have their capital in Jerusalem, and they need to have their own capital. With Muslims, Jews, Christians, they all have a connection to Jerusalem, and that needs to be a city to all people. Okay, Biden, that's cool. But the question is, why would Israel ever agree to this? The Palestinian leader who met with Biden said that the Palestinians need to have their own rights, their own government, their own state, and that is the key to peace. The idea on the table that they have now is to revert back to the original lines drawn back in 1967. Now, in case you don't know, just a quick look back. In biblical times, the Israelis assumed that the land, now known as Israel, belonged to them because God said so. But the Palestinians lived there already for hundreds and hundreds of years. But even so, in 1948, the Israelis made a claim to the land and declared themselves an independent country. This land was thought to be Palestinian land, including the city of Jerusalem, which is where most religions are thought to even have begun. But of course, the neighbors around the new country of Israel, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, they were very, very much against this idea. So for the next 20 years, everyone kind of fought about it. But Israel had a chance to form alliances, and in doing so, they built up a incredible military with the help of the U.S. So with Egypt and Iran and Syria, Jordan all joining in against Israel, Israel decided enough was enough. Time for war. So they blew up most of the Egyptian Air Force on the very first day. And the Jordanians who made its way to Israel, the Israelis overpowered them with their military weapons. And after 6 days, the whole thing ended, thus naming it the 6-Day War. But during that 6 days, Israelis had solidified its place in the region. And now, all of a sudden, 500,000 Palestinians were now under the rule of the Israelis. And the Israelis had doubled its size of lands, taking the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and now all of Jerusalem. So now, what are we going to do? Just go back to the original lines in 1967 and just call it a day? You think everybody would be happy with that? You know, this was basically the same idea that Obama had previously. However, Trump completely abandoned that idea and proclaimed Jerusalem the capital of the Israeli government, angering the entire Muslim world. But would the Israelis ever accept a divided country? Most likely not in my lifetime, because what would happen next? Peace? I'm sure that they don't think so. Once they hand over the Palestinians a state of their own, what would other countries like Iran do? They are not friends to Israel. And after the ex-President Trump threw out the nuclear arms deal with Iran, they have been feverishly working on getting that nuclear bomb finally made. This was, of course, a big issue when Biden made his visit, as Israel would be happy if the U.S. would just blow Iran off the map. But that's not what Biden's going to do. He thinks that he can get the Iran deal back and get it back on the table and...
Nabulabog ang graduation rite sana sa Ateneo University nang biglang mamaril ang isang lalaki at nahagip ng bala ang 4 na tao. Ayon sa paunang investigasyon, ang suspect ay nakilalang si Chow Chow Yumol, 38 years old, isang doktor at residente ng Lamitan, Basilan. Patay sa pamamaril sina Lamitan Executive Assistant Victor Capistrano at isang security guard ng Ateneo. Habang sugatan ang dating mayora ng Lamitan na si Rose Purigay at ang anak nito na si Hana. Base sa investigasyon ay personal na galit ng dahilan kaya nagawa ng suspect ang krimen. Ayon mismo sa suspect ay sinampahan siya ng 79 libel cases ng pamilya Purigay kaya hindi siya makapag-practice ng kanyang propesyon. Matapos ang pamamaril ay nang-agaw ng sasakyan at nagdangkang tumakas si Yumol, subalit nakasagasa ng mga bystanders at hinabol ng taong bayan at doon na rin naabutan ng kapulisan. Sa kasalukuyan ay nasa kustodiya na ng QCPD ang suspect at ayon kay Police Brigadier General Remus Medina, ang pangyayari ay isang isolated case at walang dapat ikabahala ang publiko. Samantala, nagpasalamat naman si Quezon City Mayor Joy Belmonte sa mabilis ang pagkakaaresto ng suspect. Ito si Chris Lucas, nag-uulat para sa DCRJ 8:10 AM ang Radyo Bandido TV.
Peacefully get Iran to stop working on a nuclear bomb. But Iran is like, we would really like to go back to the way things were, to our nice deal, but what if Trump is president again? What then? What if we sign a whole new deal and he comes back in and rips the whole thing up? So that's a problem. And the Israeli prime minister said to Biden, words will not stop them. Diplomacy will not stop them. The only thing that will stop Iran is knowing that if they continue to develop their nuclear program, the free world will use force. So there's that. Also, Biden stopped in to do some fist bumping with the Saudi Arabian crown prince. This was something that surprised many people. Not the fist bump, but even the meeting with the crown prince. American intelligence is convinced that he ordered the brutal assassination of the U.S. Arab reporter Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi, his then fiance, came out and said, what would Jamal Khashoggi tweet today? Something like, hey, POTUS, is it the accountability you promised for my murder? The blood of the prince's next victim is on your hands. Biden had vowed time and time again to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state because of the murder. But that was before gas prices went way, way up, and currently the world is trying to do without Russian oil. If the crown prince is really a killer, okay, you know, he kind of is a killer. But he's got oil. And sometimes you just need to forget human rights when it comes to gas prices. The prince needs the U.S. for its security, and the U.S. needs better gas prices. The prince knows that the future of Saudi needs things other than oil to make money. Hey, you know, there's battery-powered cars now, so it needs investment and tourism and to change its image as one of the biggest human rights violators in the modern world. Biden is obviously well aware that the OPEC Plus agreement runs out in September, and this could open the door for more oil production. So it's very, very important for Biden to get himself back into the good graces of the U.S. people by doing this. Right now, it looks bad for his parties in the upcoming election. But if he can get gas prices down and the economy back in order, then maybe it won't be the catastrophe that many people are predicting. In any case, it looks like Biden will survive his Middle East visit and will stay on his bike pretty well. Let's just see how the ride is once he gets back home. This is Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We bring you the most interesting stories from around the world. 187 minutes. That's the topic of the upcoming hearing in the U.S. of what really happened on January 6th when an angry mob stormed the Capitol building to stop the transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Through all the testimony that has been these past few weeks from the higher-ups and the support staff and the assistants and the aides, from the people who were in the angry mob, where you're now starting to see what happened during the 187 minutes. The time the U.S. Capitol was under siege, mostly what the President of the United States was doing while the Capitol of the U.S. was being overrun by people claiming to be there to kill the Vice President, among other people. Now, for a while, we were not sure exactly what the President was doing during the time of the riot in the Capitol, but as more and more people are coming to testify, it's starting to come as more of a light of truth. The people testifying are those that were closest to Trump, people he worked with, people he either chose or his associates chose to be there running the White House. Now, coming up next week, the committee and the hearings are going to really focus on those 187 minutes. So far, according to Stephanie Grissom, the former press secretary, Trump was enthralled with watching the riots unfold. He sat there watching the violence ensue as supporters battered the police and rampaged through the building. He was described as gleefully watching it. According to her, he gushed and said, "Hey, look at all those people fighting for me." She recounted that he kept hitting the rewind button and watched certain parts over and over again. He was loving it. She said that out of desperation, she asked his wife, Melania, please tweet out a message telling people to stand down. And Trump's wife said no. Also, Sarah Matthews testified about the tweet Trump set out in the middle of the riot, in which instead of telling the people to stand down, he tweeted the vice president had let them all down. She said it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. This came as protesters read that tweet over a bullhorn so everyone could hear it. Then his son, Donald Trump Jr., and Fox News host Sean Hannity sent messages to the Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, begging him to ask the president to call the thing off. Even his daughter, Ivanka, asked her father twice, please stop the riots, but he wouldn't listen. So this week in the hearing, it comes to the testimony of Pat Cipollone, the White House lawyer who came to Mark Meadows and said, hey, they are literally calling for Vice President Mike Pence to be effing hung. In which Meadows replied, Trump believes that Mike deserves it. As all the people in the White House were flipping out about what was happening, Trump couldn't understand why people were so upset. He thought the whole insurrection on the Capitol of the United States was great. Finally, after 187 minutes of watching windows being smashed and Congress people hiding behind chairs in the balcony, Trump very reluctantly recorded a message telling people to go home, saying, we loved you, you're very special. But at no time did he call the National Guard or even the D.C. police. Trump claimed that he asked Congress to bring 20,000 National Guard troops ahead of the attack, and that's the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, they denied that request. However, so far there has been no evidence of this. The National Guard said they never received such a request, and Pelosi and Schumer said they never got any kind of request for any National Guard troops. In fact, in the hearing, they showed discussions leading up to the riot in which Trump and his allies kept the idea of the walk to the Capitol a secret from everyone. In fact, Even his Republican friends on the Hill didn't even know, nor did his vice president know. Which brings up another interesting point about the Secret Service. During that 187 minutes that the Secret Service tried to remove the vice president from the building, they rushed him down through the tunnels into a loading dock and attempted to put him into a vehicle. This is where something weird happened. The vice president refused to get into the car. Now, you would think there's an angry mob chasing the vice president saying, "Hang Mike Pence," that Pence would want to get the heck out of there. But he didn't. So this is posing a big question. Was it at that moment that Pence realized that the Secret Service was trying to get him out of there? Not to save his life, but maybe to rather make sure that he could not certify the election? Could that be true? Many in the hearing, including Republican Adam Kinzinger, believe that Pence realized he was a pawn in the scheme to overthrow the election and put it into chaos. If they were able to get the vice president into that car, then the election would not have been certified on the 6th, and by law would have gone to Congress to decide it. It was there that Trump and his allies thought they could get the Republicans to claim the election was a fraud and that he was still the president and not Joe Biden. Theoretically, that could have worked since, nothing else he tried seemed to work, such as the mountains of court cases in which he lost, or trying to intimidate election officials in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arkansas, claiming all the mail-in ballots are fraudulent, having the military seize voting machines, sending in fake electors and having them spend the night in the Capitol so that they could show up in the morning before the real electors got there. And of course, urging the Justice Department to declare the election was corrupt. But none of that worked. So in a last-ditch effort, Trump got his people to rush the Capitol, took over the congressional building, stopped the certification, then get his Republicans to muck up the swamp with legal procedures to keep him as the president. The problem was, Mike Pence wouldn't get in the car. He stayed. Even though people were literally after his neck, he stayed and certified the election. Maybe after all that time working with Trump, he realized that he was on the wrong side of history. We don't really know. However, whatever was in Pence's mind, he stayed there and he certified the election. Pat Cipollone testified that Pence should get the Medal of Freedom for his efforts. But really, he was just doing his job and not breaking the law. Not sure about getting a Medal of Freedom for that. But still, there are ongoing questions about, was this coup attempt planned, or was it just an accident caused by a overzealous president who didn't want to leave? So, introducing a new character in the story, Steve Bannon. Remember Steve? We've talked about him much here in the past few years, and now he's back. Now he's been subpoenaed to speak in front of the committee and turn over documents regarding his involvement in the January 6th coup attempt, but he refused. So he's about to go on trial for contempt of Congress. Now, Steve has tried to delay his trial by citing a whole bunch of reasons, but no can do. He will go on trial on Monday. Now, the reason I bring this up is the crazy twist that happened in all this stuff going on this week. Bannon all of a sudden agreed to testify in front of Congress. But the stipulation was that it had to be live and on television. Now, to me, this seemed like a way to lure the committee in so that he can get on TV and blow the whole proceeding up. Well, it seems I'm not alone in this kind of thinking. The committee said, of course, we are not going to let him come on live television without first answering several questions under oath behind closed doors so that they can check to see if what he is saying is true. This is how these hearings work. You say things under oath first. Then when you go before the committee live in front of the world, you can't really lie because they have pre-recorded you and they can corroborate your story or not. And honestly, they don't really need to have Bannon come in because this week somehow a recording of Bannon has surfaced, which he very blatantly described the plan that they had concocted on how to steal the U.S. election. He said on the tape what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. But that doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. And then you hear Bannon's evil laugh. He said that Trump had planned to make an announcement around 10 or 11 p.m. on the night of the election, and he would walk out of the Oval Office and announce that he had won the election. He also said that how they knew that it was very possible that early on Trump may be ahead in the vote count because the fact that many Republicans generally vote early, and Trump had told them not to use mail-in ballots. He said that Trump already had plans to tweet out, "I'm the winner, game owner. Suck on that." They were counting on the fact that Democrats would most likely use the mail-in ballots and that those would be counted later in the evening. So Trump's going to declare himself the winner. In the morning, of course, there will be a firestorm because he will have lost. And that is exactly what happened. Because on the evening of the actual election, Trump came on the news and said, frankly, we did win the election. He did this well before millions and millions of ballots had been counted. And then said, you're going to have Antifa crazy, the media crazy, the courts are crazy, and Trump's going to be sitting there mocking, tweeting stuff like, you lose, I'm the winner, I'm the king. The idea of throwing the country into total chaos. But honestly, it didn't really turn out that way, did it? Remember, back when he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton in 2016, but he won the Electoral College, making him the president, he claimed he won in a landslide. But actually, the counts were very close, literally by a few hundred votes per state. If that had happened, maybe this would have worked a little better. But the margin between Biden and Trump was very wide. In the swing states, Biden won by tens of thousands of votes. It made it very hard for Trump to claim that he was the real winner, and with all these huge margins. So since the country didn't go into chaos as they had planned right after the election, Trump just declared the whole election was a fraud, that the Democrats stole it from him. And pretty much 100% of Trump's people believed him. But the problem was his aides and side lawyers had many problems proving that the election was stolen. They came up with crazy ideas on how the election was stolen. They took it to court time and time again. Some of the judges in the court that they went to were picked by Trump himself. But all the cases were either thrown out of court or lost due to lack of evidence. Now, here's where we get into one of the most interesting stories as it comes from White House counsel Pat Cipollone, as he recounted about how he ran to the Oval Office on the night of December 18th when he heard that Sidney Powell, she's the lawyer who was on TV saying the elections were rigged by the Venezuelans, and that disgraced National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who talked a lot about here on the show, he wanted Trump to enact martial law with the military. And then this guy, Patrick Bryan, someone I never heard of, who used to be the head of Overstock.com, but then he had to resign. Anyway, they were all there with Trump. And Cipollone came in and like, how did you people get into the White House? So he sat there in this meeting and listened to this bunch of crazy, ridiculous stories, such as Michael Flynn's theory that the Nest thermostats from the vote counting machines are somehow connected to the internet, and that's how they were able to get in and change the votes. Anyway, that meeting turned into a screaming match in which everybody in the hallways could hear. There were even threats of violence between them. What later was said happens that the president, what they were saying was the president had decided to grant Sidney Powell to head up a special counsel to investigate the election. So after a number of verbal attacks, Pat Cipollone said, hey, listen, you guys lost 60 cases in the courts, so where is your evidence? To which Powell blew back, well, the courts are corrupt. To which Pat Cipollone said, everyone, all of them are corrupt, even the ones that the president appointed the judges? Oh, and I almost forgot, Rudy Giuliani was there, and he called everyone the P word. And at one point, Flynn stood up and screamed to the White House counsel, "Hey, you guys are all quitters." At that point, one of the lawyers told him, "Either you come over here, basically to fight me, or you sit your behind," that's not the word he used, "back down in that chair." Anyway, later, after everyone was tired of screaming, Trump left with the lawyers, who explained to him that these people were all nuts and none of these ideas were ever going to work. That's when Trump sent out the infamous tweet, "Big protest on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." This is what the Sixth Committee is naming his call to arms. When everything else failed, the only option was to make sure that the vote never happened on January 6th and that the election would be decided in Congress. So that's when Trump told his followers to go to the Capitol, knowing there was going to be violence, knowing they were going to blow past police and storm the Capitol. This, according to the committee, was Trump's plan. It was his only option left because nothing else had worked. And probably it would have worked, but the vice president did his job, and that screwed the whole thing up. I guess now we know why it was okay with him for Mike Pence to be hung by his neck by an angry mob. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Remember when we talked about that mass shooting? I know what you're saying. Which one? Well, I wanted to talk about that one in Uvalde, Texas. This is the one that the young white man brought his high-powered rifle, took it into his old school where he used to go to school, where he walked in the classroom and killed 19 young children and 2 teachers. Then, over an hour later, after he went into the school, guys from the Border Patrol finally came in and they finally shot him, killed him. People kept saying, why did it take so long for them to take down this shooter? It's just one guy. Well, this week we may have learned why. See, there were cameras all over the school, but for some reason the police were holding on to the footage so no one could see it. But somehow, as it always does, the footage got released and we got to see exactly what happened. As you watch the video, you see the shooter just casually walking into the school with his rifle in hand, walking down the hall. Then, just moments after the police came in, you see them walking toward the classroom. Then a shot is fired. Then the policemen appear to run away. They retreat back to the front of the hallway and wait. Then one officer gets some hand sanitizer, and then one officer checks his phone. But the issue may have been with this officer that they were there 3 minutes after the shooter was there. They crept right up to the door right after they got there to the room where the shooter was. Several of them were right there on the other side of the door where the shooter was. But when he shot a few more rounds off, the officers retreated rather than busting in and shooting the guy. Then after they were safely back down the hallway, the shooter began killing children. However, the police just waited and waited and waited. Some more officers showed up, but then they waited and they listened as the gunmen continued to shoot the kids. According to experts, this goes against all the training that police are given to deal with in a situation like this. They teach safety. However, according to the National Tactical Officers Association, they are taught to overcome that sort of primal instinct of self-preservation and push through to address the threat. They're saying that generally, delays in confronting a gunman can cost civilians their lives. And officers should immediately move toward the gunman, alone if needed, to stop the killing. But these officers were not alone. There were a whole bunch of them there. They wore body armor. Some of them had ballistic shields, and they had their own high-powered rifles. The man who was checking his phone, ironically, had just gotten a message from his wife that she was in the classroom and was shot. She actually later died. Supposedly he tried to intervene, but was instead removed from the building, and his weapon was taken from him. Also, during all this time, the police were standing there. The children inside the classroom were messaging their parents, "There's a guy here shooting us." So why were the officers waiting outside the classroom for an hour? Were they waiting for the shooter to come out? Were they waiting for orders that just never came? Also, we know is that much, much later, the Border Patrol showed up. The Border Patrol, they went in, they shot him very easily. So how many children would be alive if the Uvalde police would have just done that? In any case, as you could have imagined, the parents of the children that were killed are livid about this video. 2 reasons. One, the video was released to the public before they even saw it. They were not allowed to see it because of the ongoing investigation. Of course, the investigation was pretty clear cut and dry to me, as, the gunman was guilty. And the second reason was the obvious overwhelming amount of time that the police just hung out in front of the door while their children were getting shot. An official from the Texas Department of Public Safety said that this was an abject failure, that this was certainly a mess with many people to blame. He goes on, and why was this happening? Why did they not go outside the school? Did the police not think to look in a window from the outside? Maybe find another breach point? Many times they will engage the shooter from a window because he would be in their line of sight, but they wouldn't be in his. He said, I'm not sure, without having the benefit of interviewing and speaking to the officers that were on the scene, what they were thinking and why they were so singularly focused on remaining in the interior of the school and trying to get the suspect that might have been easier to get from the outside, which, theoretically be a lot easier to do and potentially much faster. Even the U.S. Border Patrol, who were armed to the hilt, they waited for a while before they went in and shot the guy. But when they went in, it was very quick. A person from the National Tactical Officers Association, again, he spoke briefly. One of the biggest things that need to change going forward is the need for good leadership in a situation like this and people being trained better. He said, you don't have minutes to think and figure out what to do. You have seconds. And every second that passes could potentially be someone getting shot. So another chapter in the story of one of the worst school shootings in U.S. history. What I find interesting in all this is that the head of the police had a news conference after this was over, commending the police for a job well done. One thing I know for sure is that every family from every child killed or injured in that shooting is going to be suing the state. The question, though, is, will criminal charges be brought against the officers like in the Parkland shooting, where there's currently an officer that's on trial right now from running from the shooting? That one left 17 people dead. So besides the fact that the military assault rifles should be banned in the U.S., it seems like that the police in Texas need to get some better training. Or maybe just get some heroism. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. So let's get over to some interesting medical news. When I first came to the Philippines, I remember driving from the airport and seeing all the signs for whitening. Beautiful women smiling and some kind of logo about whitening. Now, I didn't pay that much attention because we have whitening in the U.S. It's pretty popular in the U.S. You have Crest whitening toothpaste. You have AIM whitening toothpaste. You have whitening strips for the teeth, whitening gels that you rub on your teeth. And of course, you have whitening ultraviolet light that you can spend $300 for at the dentist's office. But after a while, I realized one thing in the Philippines. Whitening there is not for your teeth. Like in the United States, it's for your skin. Filipinos love to have white skin, which is so strange to Americans because, well, we all want to have dark skin. I guess you always want what you don't have. But what this all reminded me of actually was a time that I spent in Africa. I remember being in the jungle. I was in the jungle. I was in a canoe in the Zambezi River. Long story. At the end, you're supposed to give your guide a gift. Through my time in Africa, most of the people asked me for one thing: sunscreen. Why on earth do you think Africans would want sunscreen? I mean, you're black. You're black. Africans are black. They said because they want to have lighter skin because it's beautiful. And they had the idea that sunscreen would help them do that. Well, jumping ahead a few decades, turns out a lot of people do that in Africa. And in Africa, like in the Philippines, they love whitening creams. They have the idea it's going to make them white and beautiful. But there's a problem now in Rwanda. The government there has put a ban on all whitening creams. Now, before they had put a ban on them, but now they are strictly enforcing it. If you get caught with whitening cream in Rwanda, there's a jail sentence of 2 years and a fine of 5 million Rwandan francs, about 250,000 pesos. There's a story I read about this one 27-year-old who has been using whitening cream for many years and believes that it has gotten her lighter. And she is very, very worried now that it will go back to being black again. The problem is, ironically, the only place you can get whitening cream is on the black market. You have to find a supplier. But suppliers are hard to get because there are government plants everywhere. People that set up the suppliers to get busted with all their creams. So, if you're not among the chosen, you won't be getting any creams, which is known as mukorogo. But why? Why is the government so against skin whitening there? Well, according to them, it is bad for you. They say they have received countless reports of skin damage done to user skin because of applying these products. They are saying that because of the misuse of this product, leaving it on the skin for so long to try and get better results, to get whiter skin, it's causing damage to the faces of people in the public. Because there's mercury and steroids. They believe it's toxic to your health. But the demand still remains very high, which keeps the markets moving, and the skin whitening underground continues to flourish. Now, skin whitening used to be around $2 there, about 100 pesos per container, but now, with the stricter enforcement, it has doubled in price and even gone higher. The average Rwandan, by the way, makes around 42,000 Rwanda francs. That's about 2,000 pesos a month. When you go to get, there are a range of signals that you need to do in order to get your creams. People need to know these signals to get the cream, but they have to be very aware of the undercover whitening agents that are everywhere that could arrest you. So anyway, if you're planning to go see the mountain gorillas of Rwanda, make sure you bring your own whitening cream and mark the container as tooth whitening, just to be safe. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam. We are out of time. Thank you so much for spending your Sunday evening with us here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We will be back again next week with more interesting stories going on around the world. So please join us then. And until then, everybody be safe out there. We'll see you next week.